Hello. How's everybody? I'm Kristen. I'm the director of the Island Free Library here on Block Island. I'm on the second floor of the library, the upper level, we call it. It is Tuesday, the Tuesday after Memorial Day. It is Tuesday, May 26th. This is sort of a funny week. We have a whole week of May. Oh, shoot, let me turn that off. That is my computer making notification noises. Okay, that's shut now. We have a whole funny week here after Memorial Day. We have I think Memorial Day was probably the earliest it can ever be. And so now we have a whole week of May this week. So I feel like that's a bonus. I'm going to enjoy that. I did some work from home yesterday, and I was playing in the YouTube channel, and boy, I watched myself a couple times. I say a lot, so I'm going to work on that. That is going to be, not that I'm ever going to be a TV star here, but I think it'll be more enjoyable for you if I limit my ums. I don't even realize how often I say it, so I'm going to practice that. Hi, Dad. I've just come from the third, I have just come from the third workshop in a series of workshops on diversifying library collections, a diversity audit, and why you do it and how you do it. And there was basic logistics about it. There was philosophical discussions about it. And I think about that often with our collection. We've done great work in our collection about that. I think we've done great work in this Frankenstein Tea series about that. I've been really very conscious about reading a diverse collection of work. Today's is one of those that, he's a classic author. I've never read him, or not extensively. And I think the story I chose is okay as far as image and own voice and, what's being projected through the story. And I realized when I was reading through some short stories today of this author is that he's very good at time. I think that's what he's good at. I'm not a scholar of his, right? I'm not a scholar of his work, but it feels like he writes about time well. So, some people write about place. Some people can write about people. Some people can write memoirs. Some people, there's different things that people do well. I think this guy writes about time. I think he's able to capture the essence of the time when he lived and when he grew up. This would be about when he lived. So the surprise, the drum roll for Frankenstein Tea this is a Truman Capote story. I'm going to read a Truman Capote story today. This book is the complete stories of Truman Capote, introduction by Reynolds Price. Not the ghost, that's just automatic lights. This was published by Random House, New York. It was published in 2004. That's when this book was published, not when it was written. I'm reading a story that was written in 1950. I think I just read that Capote was born in 1924. Let me see if I can find that. Let me just be clear about that, because that would be about right? He's writing about 1924, September 30th, 1924 in New Orleans. So this book written in 1950, he's 26 years old. Good Lord, I hope I just did out loud live TV math correctly. So this is from 1950, and I think, again, I'm not a Capote scholar, but I think that could be what he's good at. After reading just a few stories this morning, it seems that he can capture a time period well. Maybe that's what he was famous for. Maybe you're a Truman Capote scholar. Let me know if I'm on the right track there. This is Truman Capote for Frankenstein Tea today, an afternoon check-in with adult stories from the Island Free Library. I read every day at 3 o'clock. I'm going to continue to read every day at 3 o'clock for quite some time. This is called The Bargain. Several things about her husband irritated Mrs. Chase. For instance, his voice. He sounded always as though he were bidding in a poker game. To hear his unresponsive drawl was exasperating, especially now when, talking to him on the telephone, she herself was strident with excitement. Of course I already have one. I know that. But you don't understand, dear. It's a bargain, she said, stressing the last word, then pausing to let its magic develop. Simply silence happened. Well, you could say something. No, I'm not in a shop. I'm at home. Alice Severin is coming for lunch. It's her coat that I'm trying to tell you about. Certainly you remember Alice Severin. His leaky memory was another irritant. And though she reminded him that out in Greenwich they had often seen Arthur and Alice Severn, and had, in fact, entertained them, he pretended no knowledge of the name. It doesn't matter, she sighed. I'm only going to look at the coat anyway. Have a good lunch, dear. Later, as she fussed with the precise waves of her touched-up hair, Mrs. Chase admitted that really there was no reason why her husband should have remembered the Severins too clearly. She realized this when, with faulty success, she tried to arouse an image of Alice Severn. There, she almost had it. A rosy, gangling woman, less than 30, and always riding in a station wagon, accompanied by an Irish setter and two beautiful gold-red children. It was said that her husband drank, or was it the other way around? Then, too, they were supposed to be a bad credit risk. At least Mrs. Chase recalled once hearing of incredible debts, and someone, was it herself, had described Alice Severn as just too bohemian. Before moving into the city, the Chases had kept a house in Greenwich, which was a bore to Mrs. Chase, for she disliked the hint of nature there and preferred the amusement of New York shop windows. In Greenwich, at a cocktail party at the railway station, they'd now and again encountered the Severins. That was all it had amounted to. We were not even friends, she concluded, somewhat surprised. As so happens when one hears suddenly from a person of the past and someone known in a different context. She had been startled into a feeling of intimacy. On second thought, however, it seemed extraordinary of Alice Severn, whom she'd not seen in over a year, to have called offering for sale a mink coat. Mrs. Chase stopped in the kitchen to order a soup and salad lunch. It never occurred to her that not everyone was on a diet. She filled a sherry decanter and brought it with her into the living room. It was a green, glass-bright room, rather like her, too youthful taste in clothes. Wind bustled the windows, for the apartment was high up with an aeroplane view of downtown Manhattan. She put a linguaphone record on a phonograph and sat in an unrelaxed position, listening to the strained voice, pronouncing French phrases. In April, the Chases planned to celebrate their 20th anniversary with a trip to Paris. For this reason, she had undertaken the linguaphone lessons. And for this reason, too, she considered Alice Severin's coat. It was more practical, she felt, to travel in a second-hand mink. Later on, she might have it made into a stole. Alice Severn arrived a few minutes early, an accident, certainly, for she was not an anxious person, at least judging from her subdued, ambling manner. She wore sensible shoes, a tweed suit that had seen its best days, and carried a box tied with a scrappy cord. I was so delighted when you called this morning. Heaven knows it's been an age, but of course we never get to Greenwich anymore. Though smiling, her guest remained silent, and Mrs. Chase, keyed to an effusive style, was a little taken aback. As they seated themselves, her eyes caught at the younger woman, and it occurred to her that if they had met casually, she might not have known her. Not because her appearance was so very altered, but because Mrs. Chase realized that she had never before looked closely at her, which seemed odd, for Alice Severn was someone you would notice. If she had been less long, more compact, one might have passed over her, perhaps remarking that she was attractive. As it was, with her red hair, the sense of distance in her eyes, her freckled, autumnal face, and gaunt, strong hands, there was a distinction about her not easily disregarded. Sherry? Alice Severn nodded, and her head, balanced precariously on her thin neck, was like a chrysanthemum, too heavy for its stalk. Cracker? Offered Mrs. Chase, observing that anyone so lean and stretched out must eat like a horse. Her soup and salad skimpiness gave her a sudden qualm, and she told the following lie. I don't know what Martha's making for lunch. You know how difficult it is on short notice. But tell me, dear, what is happening in Greenwich? In Greenwich? She said, her eyelids beating as though an unexpected light had flared in the room. I have no idea. We haven't lived there for some while, 6 months or more. Oh, said Mrs. Chase. You see how far behind I am. But where are you living, dear? Alice Severn lifted one of her bony, awkward hands and waved it toward the windows. Out there, she said peculiarly. Her voice was plain, but it had an exhausted quality, as though she were coming down with a cold. In town, I mean. We don't like it much. Fred, especially. With the dimmest inflection, Mrs. Chase said, Fred? For she perfectly remembered Arthur as the name of her guest's husband. Yes, Fred, my dog, an Irish setter. You must have seen him. He's used to space, and the apartment is so small. A room, really. Hard days indeed must have fallen if all the Severns were living in one room. Curious as she was, Mrs. Chase checked herself and did not inquire into this. She tasted her sherry and said, Of course I remember your dog and the children, all 3 of their red heads hanging out of your station wagon. The kids haven't red hair. They're blondes, like Arthur. The correction was given so humorlessly that Mrs. Chase was provoked into a puzzled small laugh. And Arthur, how is he? She said, preparing to stand and lead the way to lunch. But Alice Severn's answer made her sit down again, delivered with no change in her placidly undecorated expression. It consisted of only fatter. Fatter, she repeated after a moment. The last time I saw him, I guess it was only a week ago. He was crossing a street, almost waddling. If he had seen me, I would have had to laugh. He was always so finicky about his figure. Mrs. Chase touched her lips. You and Arthur, separated? It's simply remarkable. We're not separated. She brushed her hand in the air as though to clear away cobwebs. I've known him since I was a child, since we were both children. Do you think, she said quietly, that we could ever be separate of each other, Mrs. Chase? The exact use of her name seemed to exclude Mrs. Chase. Fleetingly, she felt herself sealed off. And as they went together toward the dining room, she imagined a hostility to move between them. Possibly it was the sight of Alice Severn's gawky hands fumbling, unfolding a napkin, that persuaded her this was not true. Except for courteous exchanges, they ate in silence, and she was beginning to fear there was not to be a story. At last, as a matter of fact, said Alice Severn, blurting it out, we were divorced last August. Mrs. Chase waited, then, between the dip and rise of her soup spoon, said, How awful. His drinking, I suppose. Arthur never drank, she answered with a pleasant but astonished smile. That is, we both did. We drank for fun, not to be mean. It was very nice in the summer. We used to go down to the brook and pick mint and make mint juleps, huge ones in fruit jars. Sometimes on hot nights when we couldn't sleep, we used to fill the thermos full of cold beer and wake up the kids. Then we would drive out to the shore. It's fun to drink beer and swim and sleep on the sand. Those were lovely times. I remember once we stayed till daylight. No, she said, some serious idea tightening her face. I'll tell you, I'm almost a head taller than Arthur, and I think it worried him. When we were children, he always thought he would outgrow me, but then he never did. He hated to dance with me, and he loves to dance. And he liked a lot of people around, tiny little people with high voices. I'm not like that. I just wanted us. In those ways, I wasn't a pleasure to him. Now, you remember Jeannie Borkman, the one with the round face and the curls, about your height? I should say I do, said Mrs. Chase. She was on the Red Cross committee. Dreadful. No, said Alice Severn, pondering. Jeannie isn't dreadful. We were very good friends. The strange thing is, Arthur used to say he hated her, but then I guess he was always crazy about her. Certainly he is now, and the kids too. Somehow I wish the kids didn't like her, though I should be happy that they do, since they have to live with her. It isn't true. Your husband married to that awful Borkman girl? Since August. Mrs. Chase, pausing first to suggest that they have coffee in the living room, said, It's outrageous for you to be living alone in New York. At least you could have the children with you. Arthur wanted them, said Alice Severn simply. But I'm not alone. Fred is one of my closest friends. Mrs. Chase gestured impatiently. She did not enjoy fantasy. A dog? It's nonsense. There is nothing to think except that you're a fool. Any man that tried to walk over me would get his feet cut to pieces. I suppose you haven't arranged that he should, she hesitated, should contribute. You don't understand. Arthur hasn't any money, said Alice Severn, with the dismay of a child who has discovered that grown-ups, after all, are not very logical. He's even had to sell the car and walks back and forth between the station. But you know, I think he's happy. What you need is a good pinch, said Mrs. Chase, as though she were ready to do the job. It's Fred that bothers me. He's used to space, and only one person doesn't leave many bones. Do you suppose that when I finish my course, I could get a job in California? I'm studying at a business school, but I'm not awfully quick, especially at typing. My fingers seem to hate it so. I guess it's like playing the piano. You should learn when you're very young. She glanced speculatively at her hands, sighing. I have a lesson at 3. Would you mind if I showed you the coat now? The festiveness of things coming out of a box could usually be counted on to cheer Mrs. Chase. But as she saw the lid taken off, a melancholy uneasiness cornered her. It belonged to my mother, who must have worn it 60 years, thought Mrs. Chase, facing a mirror. The coat hung to her ankles. She rubbed her hand against the lusterless, balding fur, and it was moldy, sour, as though it had lain in an attic by the seashore. It was cold inside the coat. She shivered. At the same time, a flush heated her face. For just then she noticed that Alice Severn was gazing over her shoulder, and in her expression there was a drawn, undignified expectancy that had not been there before. Where sympathy was concerned, Mrs. Chase knew thrift. Before giving it, she took the precaution of attaching a string so that if necessary, it could be yanked back. Looking at Alice Severn, however, it was as though the string had been severed, and for once she was confronted head-on with the obligations of sympathy. She wriggled even so, hunting a loophole, but then her eyes collided with those other eyes, and she saw there was none. The recollection of a word from her linguaphone lessons made a certain question easier. Combien? She said. It isn't worth anything, is it? There was confusion in the asking, not frankness. No, it isn't, she said tiredly, almost testily, but I may have some use for it. She did not inquire again. It was clear that part of her obligation was to be fulfilled by fixing a price herself. Still trailing the clumsy coat, she went to a corner of the room where there was a desk and, writing with resentful jabs, made a check on her private account. She did not intend that her husband should know. More than most, Mrs. Chase despised the sense of loss. A misplaced key, a dropped coin, quickened her awareness of theft and the cheats of life. Some similar sensation was with her as she handed the check to Alice Severn, who, folding it and without looking at it, put it in her suit pocket. It was for $50. Darling, said Mrs. Chase, grim with superious concern, you must ring me and let me know how everything is going. You mustn't feel lonely. Alice Severn did not thank her, and at the door she did not say goodbye. Instead, she took one of Mrs. Chase's hands in her own and patted it, as though she were gently rewarding an animal, a dog. Closing the door, Mrs. Chase stared at her hand, brought it near her lips. The feel of the other hand was still upon it, and she stood there, waiting while it drained away. Presently, her hand was again quite cold. That was Truman Capote. That short story was called The Bargain. It's from a book of Truman Capote stories, The Complete Stories of Truman Capote, published by Random House. This is Frankenstein Tea, a daily program brought to you from the Island Free Library. 3 o'clock every day, live on YouTube, always available for re-watching or re-listening. I hope you have a great day. Thanks for coming.